They're saying, man, if this land isn't set aside and protected, nobody will be able to see the wonders of this place.
Welcome to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Emmy Reed, back again to share with you the fascinating tale of the establishment of Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone National Park holds the distinction of being the United States' first national park. What does it mean to be the first? What was a national park in the 19th century, and does it hold the same definition today? We'll answer those questions and more as we dive into how Yellowstone became the park we know and love today. On this episode, we sit down with Alicia Murphy, who is the park historian for the National Park Service in Yellowstone National Park. Basically, it's her job to preserve and explore the history of Yellowstone, communicate the park's rich history to the public, and try not to spend too much time going down research rabbit holes. This is our very first two-part episode series on the podcast. This episode, Part 1, will explore the early history of the area that became Yellowstone National Park up to its creation in 1872. All right, let's get started learning about the establishment of our first national park. Alicia, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thrilled that you are able to join us today. So you are the National Park Service historian of Yellowstone National Park, which just sounds like one of the coolest jobs in the world to me. What drew you to become a Yellowstone historian as opposed to a medieval Europe historian or a World War II historian?
Thank you. I appreciate being on your podcast today. This is going to be fun. It's funny that you mentioned a medieval European historian. I actually, at one point in my life, considered so far as to go and check schools out in Wales to study medieval Welsh history, and then decided that uh, Yellowstone history as my area of study would be significantly more applicable since I, lived in Montana, than Welsh medieval history.
Do you have a Welsh ancestry?
I do not. I just read a lot of books and I don't know. I've just always had an interest in European history in general, particularly in the UK, and just got kind of went down a rabbit hole with obsession with Welsh history. So that's kind of
Right.
random, but luckily the Yellowstone history thing has worked out pretty well. I'm the luckiest person I know.
That's awesome. And so it was really just, are you from Montana and just having, known about Yellowstone and that was what drew you in to be like, yep, this is where I want to work and this is what I want to research?
Yeah, I have been coming to Yellowstone in this area my entire life. I'm originally from a ranch in rural South Dakota, but I have a lot of family in this area, and so I spent time. Yellowstone has always been a part of my life. So when I decided to get my bachelor's in history, I ended up focusing a lot of my research for that on Yellowstone, just kind of as a natural interest of mine. I had spent a summer working as a maid in Grant Village back in '96, and thought that Yellowstone history was just an interesting area for me in particular because of that background. I went off and did other things after my bachelor's and realized that I really, really loved Yellowstone and I really wanted to work there and be a part of that place in a more immediate way than just a casual visitor. And so I saw that the Heritage and Research Center had just opened in Gardner. I didn't really know what that was, but I was hearing about it through the Yellowstone Foundation and I was very intrigued. And so I learned more and I thought, oh man, someday maybe I could work at the Heritage and Research Center. There's a museum collection there and archives. That would be amazing. So I went back and got my master's and focused all of my research and coursework on Yellowstone history and did an internship in the museum program at the Heritage and Research Center, and from there on, I've been working in the park for the National Park Service for 16 years now in a variety of roles, mostly in planning and kind of trying to figure out what the future of Yellowstone will look like. But 6 years ago, the historian position opened up, and I was able to transfer into that position just really fortuitously. And so I went from spending my time looking at Yellowstone's future and worrying about, visitation and, compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and things like that, to really focusing on Yellowstone's past, but trying to keep that. My work background of how can we use this knowledge to better inform our decisions. So I still do think about the future of Yellowstone, but I try to bring our actions in the past into play so that we can make good decisions based on our history as we move forward in Yellowstone.
I love that, and I love your connection to Yellowstone and how it just brought you right back, and that, like, history was the way, and some people it's recreation, for some it's wildlife, but it just shows, like, how Yellowstone can affect us for life, and that's so wonderful. I'm so glad that you're in that position now and keeping the history of the park.
Thank you.
Um So, Alicia, I could spend hours upon hours talking about the history of this area. I'm also a history major, and so we could probably be on here for 10 plus hours. I'm not going to do that to you. But we're also going to try to keep this pretty high level. So, probably a pretty good place to start is the beginning. And what is the earliest data we have on people living in or traveling through the area that we now identify as Yellowstone National Park? And what do you think drew these people into Yellowstone?
This is an interesting question in a lot of ways. If you talk to some of our partners in our associated tribes, they'll tell you that there are, origin stories in Yellowstone. So there's not a date associated with that. They have been here forever. Um, However, if we wanna think about, kind of solid evidence, that you can see on the ground, then our archaeological, findings say that people have been in this area for at least 11,000 years, but, frankly, probably much longer. The people have been coming to this area for centuries upon centuries, and they've come for a variety of reasons. Some people have been drawn here, specifically to say quarry obsidian for extremely sharp projectile points or tools. Some people might have been drawn here to perform ceremonies. There's some information out there about the thermal features as being either medicinal or sacred. There's also, this is kind of in the midst of a travel way for people coming from the West Coast, heading to the Great Plains to hunt bison and other large game. And so they would have naturally come through this area, and this is kind of their route, and they would have, gone through the park that way, hunting and gathering as they went along. There are, medicinal plants in Yellowstone that are either endemic to the park or difficult to find in other areas. There's a variety of reasons people would come here, and there's also a variety of reasons why most people didn't live here year round. I mean, this is Yellowstone is an extremely harsh environment and not exactly conducive to comfortable living, especially in our winters. So most people would have visited Yellowstone as opposed to live in the park year round, although there certainly have been some tribes have claims to having that experience also though is living in the park. So I don't mean to negate that as well, but those were some hardy souls, I tell you. And this is a in a lot of ways, it's almost like a central point, for a lot of tribes that are all around and kind of we're kind of drawn to this area. So people have been on this landscape for a very, very long time.
Mhm. Gotcha. So obsidian quarries, medicinal plants, hunting opportunities. Sounds like Yellowstone was really the place to be to obtain resources that you need to survive in the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains. Pretty, like you were talking about, some pretty harsh winters in and outside of the park. That's so interesting. What are some tribes that have visited this area, lived in this area, hunted, gathered, in the park that we now know today as Yellowstone National Park?
Well, we officially have relationships with 27 different tribal governments. And so that includes, tribes from as far away as the Dakotas, and even further. So, Sioux, several of the Sioux tribes, as well as, the Nez Perce to go to the west. Obviously, Crow, Blackfoot, Shoshone Bannock. Um, there's a wide variety of tribal people that have stated that they have a real and solid connection to this place, and that they have volunteered that they want to be associated officially with Yellowstone.
Okay, got it. Can you tell us about some of the early non-indigenous expeditions to the area? And what specifically brought them to the park? I mean, I know we're aware of a lot of kind of these mythologized expeditions. You think of Lewis and Clark. Did Lewis and Clark ever come to Yellowstone? What was that like during the? I'm guessing that's like the 1800s, probably like the late 1700s.
Yeah, so Lewis and Clark did not come to Yellowstone. The closest they would have gotten would have been to Livingston, where Livingston is now, just about 50 miles north of today's park northern border. Uh, Although, John Coulter, a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, did veer off from the expedition on their return home, and, he did head down south along the Yellowstone River and go through, parts of what is today's Yellowstone National Park. So, the entire expedition didn't come through, but he did spend some time in the area. People were drawn to this area non-indigenous people were drawn to this area for some of the same reasons that indigenous people were. This was a rich landscape of game in particular, so fur-bearing animals in particular, and specifically, such as a beaver, would have brought trappers to this area. They would have been the first non-indigenous people to spend any significant time in Yellowstone. Many of those people, were not literate. They did not, you know, read or write, and so we have very limited records, mostly oral histories, of their times in the park. Just like Coulter, he did not read and write. And so, what we know about his visit to Yellowstone is through what he told Lewis when he got back east. So, other trappers that came through this area would have been people like Jim Bridger. I think he's probably the most, I don't know, famous early explorer of the area, coming here to see if he could find beaver pelts for his, profession. And he, trappers were not, they were not known for their fidelity to truth, I guess. You could say
Right.
they liked tall tales and they really enjoyed a good story around a campfire. And so Jim Bridger is an interesting one because he, like many great storytellers, knew how to combine fact and fiction to really hook his listeners. And so he would tell stories about water shooting into the air or petrified trees. That there's this remarkable place, and those are all true. But then he just had to add his own little thing by saying like petrified birds singing, petrified songs in those petrified trees, and, mountains of glass, which is, obsidian, but not really glass, and, so he, I think, started popularizing this idea of Yellowstone as an exceptional region. However, it was incredibly remote. It was very difficult to get to Yellowstone, well into the 1800s. And uh, people just frankly didn't believe him. This is just another tall tale told by good old Jim Bridger and other trappers. There was somebody as early as the 1830s another trapper who was coming through the area, and he was actually literate and wrote about his adventures. But again, people didn't remember him or believe him either. So there was this long-standing kind of in the air idea that something was going on in the upper reaches of the Yellowstone River, but nobody really quite knew how fantastical it would be until we started having official expeditions of people that documented, and were a little more socially accepted, I guess you could say. 1869, we had the Folsom Cook expedition that spent some time in the park, and then the Washburn Langford Doan expedition in 1870, and then the Hayden expedition in 1871. Those three groups, particularly the last two, really documented their time in the park really well and confirmed many of the what people thought were just tall tales, but we're able to document that and write about them and have people actually believe them, and that was the big turning point for the uh, understanding of this area and people's enthusiasm for it.
Oh, that's fascinating to me that they early trappers and explorers, they're just like, "Eh, they're just making things up, don't believe them." And then Jim Bridger, that makes me think of, have you ever seen The Revenant?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, 'cause he's, like, in that, like, as a
yes,
character.
yeah.
Yeah, is that movie, like, even accurate to, like, what life was like for trappers? And I remember them saying that the bear attack scene, like, people who had been attacked by grizzly bears were like, "Yeah, it's pretty brutal, that's what it's like." Was did you did you find that movie to be any semblance of historically accurate?
You know, I find myself falling into kind of the same trap, as maybe people hearing these stories did, in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, where I'm like, "Oh, how true are these tales?" Because of course our we only know about them as being told by these kind of unreliable narrators, but that being said, several people have told the story from different viewpoints of Hugh Glass and his experience in The Revenant, and it does they all kinda seem to tell the same general basic story. So I don't know, that was a tough scene with the horse, and yeah, there were some parts of it that I was like, "Boy, I hope that wasn't real." But this was a place where people had to rely upon themselves, and they had to encounter, even at that time, extraordinary experiences that they often had to overcome through sheer willpower, it seems. And I think that is one of the reasons that Yellowstone remained, unexplored to a large extent for so long, is that, you know, all around Yellowstone was wild area at this time period when we're talking the 1860s, 1870s, and while people were still intrigued by unexplored areas, I think, there were easier places to get to maybe to explore than someplace like the Yellowstone. It was even at that time, um, maybe, kind of one of those, places that people kind of fantasized about, but didn't really spend a lot of time actually looking into. There were several, times when expeditions were mounted to explore Yellowstone, and then for a variety of reasons, they ended up either not even getting started or getting delayed. There's a very short period of time where the weather is fine enough to mount an expedition into Yellowstone, and so you have any kind of significant delay, and you kind of have to hang it up for the year. So yeah, its geography and where it's at on the map is a part of its story in itself. Its location is almost its own character in the story of Yellowstone.
So, how did the idea of establishing this area as Yellowstone National Park come about? Was it one person spearheading the idea, or was it a group of people who were advocating for it? You know, what was that like?
Yellowstone was established in a really interesting time in our nation's history. We're coming off of the Civil War. We're in the midst of Reconstruction. We are also in the midst of the Great Westward Expansion, where resources are being consumed at a mind-boggling rate. We've had the Industrial Revolution. We've got railroads crossing the country. We have the Homestead Act that was signed, in the 1860s by President Lincoln. So people are pouring into this area. The Indian wars that had been going on across the continent for centuries were winding down to a large part. So tribal families and units were moving onto reservations, kind of opening up, as if you want to say, this area to European American settlement. So all of these things are going on at once. And the people that started coming to Yellowstone in those expeditions, particularly the Washburn expedition and the Hayden expedition, they, were savvy people. These are people who had fought in the Civil War, some of them, or many of them. These are people who were drawn to this area for economic reasons, gold mining, um, this idea of a new territory. You recall that this Montana is not even a state at this point. These are just Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming are all territories. Um, and so these are businessmen and military people, and they saw what happened back east. And I think, you know, there's in their writings, they say things like, we're worried that if this land isn't set aside, it's going to be kind of overtaken by people like us, essentially. They're saying, man, if this land isn't set aside and protected, um, nobody will be able to see the wonders of this place. And there's kind of this civic idea of, how can we protect this and have it available to to the to the world. There were common areas, back east, and there was the King's Forests in medieval England, but we're in this particular moment of time, we're in this privatization of land like probably never seen before on this continent, certainly, of wild lands on a vast scale. So, in fact, one of the members of the expeditions even said, "Man, if we don't do something about this, it'll turn into the next Niagara, and we don't want that to happen." Because they'd seen the commercialization of what happens when a natural feature becomes monetized. Um, and so I think all of those things kind of work together in this time of mass consumption of resources to protect what was special about this small, only 2 million acres of land. And, also, Congress asked, what are we taking land away from settlers? Could we be doing things with this land? And the consensus essentially was no, this is worthless. It's high elevation. It's not good for agriculture. It's forested. You couldn't really even graze it. There's no gold that anyone knows of in the boundaries. Nobody's going to want to homestead that because the weather is so poor. Uh, so we might as well preserve it and make it a national park. And, we've got Yosemite. Yosemite had been set aside for the state of California to manage by President Lincoln. Um, and they said, let's think about it kind of like Yosemite, but let's make this federally managed. It's in 3 states or territories, so they couldn't just turn it over to a state like California, so it had to be federally managed, and so it's just this kind of, there's a lot of serendipity, with Yellowstone's establishment and reservation from settlement and exploitation, of its natural resources. So, it remains to be kind of, I don't know if you wanna say a miracle, but a little bit of a miracle that Yellowstone exists as it is today, a moment in time where that was possible.
I see, interesting. Um, you touched on this, but one of the expeditions that's always kind of fascinated me was in 1871. There was a geological surveyor, Ferdinand Hayden, Hayden Valley is named after, I'm guessing?
Mhm, yep.
I thought so. So he got congressional support for an expedition, and something that was pretty cool was those 2 artists accompanied him on this exploration, and that was photographer William Henry Jackson and painter Thomas Moran, and those are, maybe not the most famous artist names, they're not Da Vinci or Michelangelo, but I think, like, in the national park space, like, they're pretty well known for what they produced during this expedition, and so can you tell us how these photographs, sketches, oil paintings, all these pieces helped influence the decision or played a role in the public awareness and support for turning this area into a national park?
Yeah, art, uh, has a long and dignified and important role in Yellowstone. You think about, all of these written words. You can put a lot of words on a piece of paper, but what is the saying? The saying is, a photo or an image or a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I think one of the reasons, certainly Hayden and his expedition was highly regarded. Hayden himself was very high up in USGS at the time. You know, we'd already had the Washburn expedition where the military leaders and leaders of this in the state of Montana were already agitating to preserve this place. Um, and so Hayden, probably would have been believed, with what he had to say about Yellowstone, which he saw as an incredible natural laboratory. He was a scientist to his bones, and he saw in Yellowstone an incredible opportunity, for the expansion of human knowledge of the natural world. And he was also smart enough to realize that he needed to have visual documentation of what this place was like in order to convince people, that this was real. This is not kind of wild ravings, and this deserved its place, as off limits to that, exploitation that we talked about earlier. So he initially, had William Henry Jackson, I mean, photographs, what could be better, right? This is before Photoshop, obviously, and so a photograph is, definitive proof in this time of, what somebody saw, so he rounded up William Henry Jackson. He also brought along another artist, Henry Wood Elliott, who was also a staff person in, USGS, and he's a cartographer, and he produced the first map of Yellowstone Lake. And he also was a very fine artist. I wish that he got more appreciation, actually. I find his artwork and his paintings that he did of Yellowstone quite charming. Um, but I think Moran was the master stroke of genius on this trip. He was a late addition. He had already done some work for Scribner's Magazine, when Langford from the 1870 expedition had submitted his, account of that expedition's time in the park. Scribner's, asked Moran, who had never been out west, to illustrate this article, and so he did his best, and he later was kind of proud and mildly surprised, I think, to realize he had done a pretty good job of translating words into imagery. But, so Scribner's and, the railroads actually paid his way to come out and join the Hayden expedition. He was not paid for by the government at all, and Hayden was kind of like, "Okay, another person to bring along. Sounds real good." He joined the expedition. The expedition started, and made their way to Yellowstone, and Moran then just joined them. um, he was not a robust outdoorsman, and this was certainly a wild adventure for him, although it did change his life. He sketched his way through the park. He left the expedition quite early also. He did not stick it out to the end. He left after, he felt like he had gotten enough sketches to really get back east and start actually, putting brush and creating masterpieces, that he would ultimately create.
Interesting, so they were mostly just sketches, he wasn't doing much painting in the field,
No,
or
yeah,
any
no,
painting? Oh,
just
cool.
sketches and, maybe some, notes on color, and then also, maybe, some tinting, to remind him later on what the colors were like, especially, like, in the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, such vibrant colors, and in, like, the thermal features, those deep blues and, brilliant oranges. He did, take those types of notes. You can actually see many of his sketches in the Heritage and Research Center if you stop by there for one of their public tours in Gardner. We have quite a few of his sketches in the collection that the public can see. And uh, so once the expedition was over, Moran had already gone back east. Jackson had his massive camera with his glass plates, and he started printing and actually producing photographs on paper. Um, and Hayden realized that especially those photographs were going to be critical in his lobbying of to Congress to create the national park. Uh, Jay Cook from the Northern Pacific Railroad was also, very keen to get this park established because he saw it as a way to bring a whole other group of people on his railroad that was quickly approaching, Billings and Livingston and Bozeman. He thought, "Man, if we can convince people to come out here, they're gonna need to take my train." And so he was also very instrumental in lobbying Congress. And remember, he was one of the ones that paid for Moran's time on the expedition. So the Hayden quickly put together some of these sketches and photographs and gave them to the members of Congress with a kind of a portfolio along with write-ups and affidavits from worthy people, that Yellowstone should be set aside. And I do think that that artwork, that photography, those sketches, were critical in convincing members of Congress and then ultimately President Grant to sign the Yellowstone Park Act and create the national park in 1872. The Hayden expedition ended in like August or September by the time they got back to Washington. And, the park was signed into being in March 1st of 1872. So that's, like 6 months later, we have a national park, and that's, kind of a whirlwind, package in today's Congress. But it just shows how truly convincing I think, they were in trying to convince Congress that this was a good idea. And, that art was critical. Moran ended up creating his masterpiece. He had several, paintings that were stunning, but his first was the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, which is just a huge piece of art, and it's of the lower falls, and it's got lots of symbolism in it, and it's, uh, beautiful, and he sold it to Congress, and it hung in the U.S. Congress building for many, many years. It's now, in the Department of Interior's museum collection on display in Washington. But you know, that rendering of what people just thought of as a sublime natural resource, uh, was, so important that it did hang in the halls of Congress.
I love that, and it makes me so, happy that art played such a role in establishing this remarkable place, and, yeah, I would see that and be like, "Yep, sign me up. What do I need to do? Done." Um, can you walk us through what it took then for, getting this support? Um, what's that process then? Maybe I can't remember Schoolhouse Rock's, creating a bill. Probably even different back then. But what was the process then from this expedition, having the support, to moving it through Congress, and then you'd mentioned, President Grant signing it. What can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, this is, I think there's a lot of backroom deals that go on, and certainly back then went on. And so, there is this kind of behind the scenes lobbying in both public and private spaces. So I think there were probably, I envision like fancy dinners back east of people sitting around with like cigars and glasses of whiskey and kind of talking about this idea, with Jay Cook or other, you know, magnates at the time or other, bankers and people in Montana, particularly that saw this as an opportunity to bring more people. These are boosters for the state or for the territory at that time. Of course, they had their eye on statehood, even then. And so there would have been these kind of deals with members of Congress. They needed to find somebody to sponsor the bill, to write the bill. And then there was a war kind of waged also in popular magazines like Scribner's. And we see this throughout Yellowstone's history that people used popular magazines, which had vast and wide readership, um, almost like today's social media, where they would, uh, you know, present ideas and argue for them, ardently in a magazine like Scribner's or Forest and Stream. Those being probably the two most influential of this general era, in this field. And getting the public on board was also important. And then, as I mentioned, Hayden put together these kind of folios. His report, I mean, that man could write. He had co-authors on his report of the expedition, but it is extensive. It's dense and kind of a slog to read through for modern eyes, but I think it was, I mean, that's an understatement.
Yeah.
But, I think was probably very impressive to members of Congress that there's this, "Wow, look at all this scientific knowledge that we're gaining already, through this," and this really is remarkable. And he had kind of experts in all the fields of people that he brought with him. He had a very robust crew on his expedition with, people, botanists and geologists and cartographers and, just people that could really. understand the importance of what they're looking at, not just, "Oh, wow, that's neat," but also, "Why is this scientifically, unusual or important?" And so he drew on all of that expertise along with the visuals from Jackson and Moran and, put together these portfolios to give to Congress. There was, very little floor debate, by the time I went through committees and everything. There was very little floor debate. They'd kind of answered all the questions they needed to, I think, ahead of time. Um, and then, by March 1st, it was on Grant's desk and he signed it. I think, a lot of people don't think of President Grant as a conservation-minded president. I think, my dad just read a biography of Grant, and I was like, "So what'd they say about the establishment of Yellowstone and his signing that?" And he was like, "Yeah, that wasn't mentioned at all." And so, I think, in some ways, again, this is just a almost like a fluke of how did this happen? And it just was, so serendipitous that Yellowstone came into being on every level, and I think just this one kind of act from a president who was, very into, expansion and, not one to, wax on about the marvels of nature, and, he still signed it. So, it's an interesting story and, it's almost anticlimactic, like, there was no, debate on the floor of Congress about, "Yes, we need to protect this beautiful place." It was just kinda like, "Yeah, okay, sure, and part of that is because the act did not come with any money tied to it, right? There were no appropriations tied to this. So this was a free, in quotes, thing for Congress to do. Okay, we'll set it aside so nobody can homestead it or mine it or, you know, nobody wants the type of trees that they've got in there. There's better trees elsewhere, easier to get to for lumber. And so, since we're not actually appropriating any money with this, what's the harm? I think was also maybe some thinking. Yeah, so it was a long time before Congress actually appropriated funds to manage Yellowstone, and I think
Oh.
I think that was a big part of it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because I was like you mentioned, yeah, I was like, not worried about the money, but just, yeah, like, manage, like, so people's gotta be there, someone's gotta build a hotel for the tourists, like, all those pieces that come with management that we think of Yellowstone today, and that was like they were like, "Nope, let's just set this land aside, we'll figure it out later." Do you know off the
Yeah.
top of your head what year that was where they started to implement more of that management and money side?
Yeah. So, the first superintendent was Langford. He was, part of the Washburn expedition and, was a prominent politician in Montana, lived in Helena. He was the superintendent for several years. He only came to the park, like, twice, um, for like quick trips. Yeah. So there was no real on the ground management until our second superintendent, Philetus Norris. He got on the scene and he was like, "Well, this is just ridiculous." And he was quite a character. He would be a fascinating dinner companion. And he was immediately agitating for funds. He started his first year as a superintendent was 1877, and he didn't get true funds, where he could actually hire somebody for a couple of years, into his time as superintendent. He was, though, a little more hands-on than Langford. He was there all summers. Uh, for many times, superintendents did not stay in the park, and they might just leave a skeleton crew, like, once the Army was, here or even once the National Park Service was established. Superintendents didn't stay in the park year-round, just because there were no visitors and, they could be more useful elsewhere. So, it wasn't till Norris really agitated for Congress to, "Hey, I need help protecting this place," and there was again a public outcry because there was so much poaching going on in Yellowstone. There was, um, you know, destruction of the thermal features. All of this was happening, but there was no funds to hire anybody to protect Yellowstone. And so Norris was the first to say, look, we have to have funds if we're going to build roads. If we want people to see this place, they need to be able to get around in it, and we need to be able to protect it. So Norris was very influential. He was kind of our first person to see the dual mission and work around it on the ground of protecting our resources while also welcoming the public, and trying to have that balance of what that looks like. He was really the first person to grapple with that and um, have any kind of success, really. And so we have him to thank for a lot of what we see in Yellowstone, and how we understand Yellowstone today can be traced back to Norris.
To continue the story and learn more about early tourism in the park, Teddy Roosevelt's connection to Yellowstone, and how Yellowstone has influenced the history of conservation in the United States, check out Part 2, available August 15th, 2024. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. To support the podcast, please consider giving a gift to the Greater Yellowstone Coalition or signing up for our emails to stay up to date with all of our conservation efforts within this amazing ecosystem. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.